Canada has been shifting aluminum exports to non-U.S. markets, and that single move has just exposed the biggest flaw in Donald Trump's tariff strategy.
So we had to revert to ship to Europe temporarily over the summer because the transactional price for aluminum was not factoring in the total cost of the tariff. It took some weeks, and finally, it has reached a threshold where metal is attracted back into North America, which means that more and more through the coming weeks and months, the end user, the consumer, will be hit by the full impact of the tariff, which will become more and more unsustainable, disruptive, and potentially create some inflationary pushback in the U.S.
When Trump slammed a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum this summer, Washington expected Ottawa to fold. Instead, Canada calmly redirected nearly half of its aluminum flow to Europe, avoided massive financial losses, and forced the United States to confront the true cost of its own protectionism. As Canada pivoted outward, North America's supposedly integrated supply chain began to crack. U.S. manufacturers faced higher costs, consumers absorbed rising prices, and the political narrative Trump tried to control slipped away. Months later, Canadian aluminum is flowing back into the U.S. market, but only because Americans finally accepted a permanently higher price tag. What Trump intended as punishment has now evolved into a textbook example of how Canada adapts, survives, and ultimately gains leverage in a global economy increasingly shaped by strategic resilience.
The situation with a 50% tariff is highly disruptive for an integrated value chain, industrial value chain like we have in North America. So we were basically losing money shipping to the U.S. We lost about $600 million over a matter of weeks, which brought Canada, the Canadian producers, to ship or to avoid shipping about 45% of the metal that normally goes to the U.S., keeping some in Canada and shipping some to Europe.
In June 2025, the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian aluminum to 50% under its revived America First industrial strategy. The White House framed the measure as economic self-defense, insisting that Canada was flooding the U.S. with cheap metal. But aluminum isn't optional for American industry. It is an essential input for cars, packaging, aviation, construction, and clean energy systems. And the reality is embarrassingly simple. The U.S. cannot meet its aluminum demand without Canada. When the tariff hit, Canadian producers immediately faced the risk of losing hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of weeks. They made the rational choice: stop shipping to a distorted market. Roughly 45% of Canada's usual aluminum exports to the United States were pulled back. Some of that metal remained inside Canada, but a significant portion moved to Europe, where long-established commercial relationships made the transition smooth. Canada avoided immense losses, protected full production capacity, and preserved stability in its industry. Throughout the summer, the U.S. market slowly adjusted to the tariff. Prices climbed. Manufacturers complained. And only once American buyers began absorbing the true cost of Trump's decision did Canadian aluminum start returning to the United States, this time at a higher price, with consumers footing the bill. This aluminum pivot tells a larger story about political power, economic strategy, and the limits of American protectionism in 2025. The first lesson is that Canada has options, far more than Trump expected. His team assumed Canada had no alternative market and would be forced to sell into the United States at a loss. That was wrong. Canadian smelters are overwhelmingly located near the coast, meaning they can load ships and reach Europe, Asia, or South America without friction. Canadian companies already have deep footprints in Iceland, Norway, and other European regions, allowing them to redirect production almost instantly. When the U.S. closed its door, the global market opened another. Europe absorbed nearly double its usual volume of Canadian aluminum during the summer months, confirming that Canada is not trapped in a North American bubble. The tariff accelerated diversification, and Canada became stronger because of it. The second lesson is that Trump broke the very supply chain he claimed he was protecting. For decades, North America operated under an unwritten agreement.
Canada produced clean, stable, reliable aluminum, and the United States consumed it. Trump shattered that balance overnight. Industry leaders on both sides of the border warned that a 50% tariff was unsustainable for an integrated industrial system. They were right. U.S. producers of cars, beverage cans, aircraft components, and infrastructure materials suddenly faced higher input costs. Those expenses cascaded through the supply chain, ultimately landing in consumer prices. In a political moment where U.S. inflation is already sensitive, Trump's tariff became an additional tax on American families. The third lesson is about leverage, and it may be the most uncomfortable truth for Washington. The aluminum dispute exposed something Trump never admits. The U.S. needs Canada far more than Canada needs the U.S. America simply does not have enough domestic aluminum capacity to replace Canadian supply. Turning to other foreign suppliers is complicated. Some involve geopolitical concerns, sanctions, or unstable markets. Canadian aluminum, meanwhile, is produced with hydroelectric power and meets the highest environmental standards in the world. It is exactly the kind of metal U.S. manufacturers want: clean, consistent, and reliable. When Canada withdrew almost half of its supply, U.S. buyers had only two choices: pay more or risk shortages. They chose to pay more. That is not a show of strength from the United States. It is a demonstration of Canadian leverage. And while the U.S. was scrambling to patch the gaps, Canada's confidence only grew. Ottawa recognized that diversification wasn't just a defensive move, it was a strategic upgrade. By opening wider channels to Europe and reinforcing ties across the Indo-Pacific, Canada reduced its exposure to U.S. volatility. In other words, Trump's tariff didn't isolate Canada, it pushed Canada to become even more globally connected. There is also a political reality unfolding in Washington. Trump's trade agenda is now being criticized not only by Democrats, but by American businesses that once supported him. The aluminum tariff added new pressure to an economy already strained by wider tariff battles with China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe. Every new tariff raises costs somewhere else in the economy. Trump claims this is part of a long-term industrial revival, but to ordinary Americans, it looks like rising prices, shrinking competition, and confusion over why their country keeps picking fights that weaken its own supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, responded with discipline. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the approach was not combative theatrics, but strategic repositioning. Ottawa allowed the market to do its work. Producers were given the freedom to redirect exports. Diplomatic channels stayed open. Canada avoided the emotional escalation that Trump often relies on. And in the end, Canada emerged as the more stable, more predictable, and more globally connected economy. The aluminum pivot also reinforces a broader trend in 2025. Canada is becoming the calm anchor in a turbulent global landscape. Investors see it, manufacturers see it, and even American companies now recognize that Canada remains one of the world's most reliable industrial partners, even if their own government treats us like a target rather than an ally.
The aluminum tariff was supposed to be Trump's demonstration of strength. Instead, it exposed the vulnerability of America's industrial system and the resilience of Canada's. Canada avoided the economic hit Trump intended, expanded its global connections, strengthened its market position, and ultimately sold its aluminum back to the United States, but only once Americans accepted the higher cost. This dispute leaves a clear and unavoidable question: if a single tariff can fracture North America's supply chain and push U.S. prices higher, what happens when Trump's next round of protectionism arrives? Because one thing is now certain: Canada can adapt, Canada can pivot, Canada can find new markets. The real instability is coming from the South, and the world is beginning to notice. Canada has just taken the strongest step yet in the North American auto showdown, and this time there is no misreading the message. Ottawa has officially withdrawn from key U.S. auto cooperation agreements, a move that flips decades of automatic alignment and places Canada firmly in control of its own industrial destiny. Washington expected frustration. What it did not expect was a clean, confident break. And tonight, the fallout is hitting the U.S. auto sector harder than any tariff ever could.
The union warns Donald Trump wants nothing less than to surgically destroy Canada's auto sector.
If we don't push back hard against him and against these companies, we're going to lose it all.
The government had exempted both Stellantis and GM from a 25% retaliatory tariff Canada imposed in response to Trump's levies. But it came with conditions.
This escalation did not arrive in a vacuum. Since early 2025, President Donald Trump's Revived America First agenda has reshaped the cross-border landscape with aggressive tariffs aimed at rewriting trade relationships. Auto imports from Canada were suddenly slapped with 25% duties, followed by public threats to raise them to 35% unless Ottawa fell back in line. These measures were marketed as a shield against China, yet the first and most damaging impact landed squarely on Canada, home to one of the most tightly integrated auto ecosystems on Earth. As Reuters and AP have repeatedly confirmed, companies reacted quickly. Stellantis pulled production out of Ontario and shifted it to Illinois, a corporate retreat that cost thousands of Canadian jobs and triggered immediate political outrage. GM began to scale down operations in Ingersoll as EV demand softened and U.S. policy grew more unpredictable. Meanwhile, the U.S. refused to offer clarity, stability, or even a pause to assess the consequences of its decisions. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government warned that Canada would not remain passive. Over the summer and fall, Ottawa reduced tariff-free import allowances for American automakers, launched dispute proceedings over Stellantis' withdrawal, and tied future privileges directly to domestic investment. But this week's announcement goes beyond tactical retaliation. Canada is stepping out of the old North American auto mindset entirely. Ottawa is suspending cooperative frameworks, freezing new sector agreements, and replacing the long-standing playbook with a fully Canadian industrial strategy built around security, independence, and reliability.
For 3 decades, the auto sector moved like a single organism. A car assembled in Michigan might carry an engine cast in Ontario and electronic components built in Quebec. Borders mattered politically, but not economically. That system depended on trust, the kind of trust that survived disagreements, elections, and policy cycles. Trump's tariff regime shattered the principle beneath that trust. Canadian-made parts were no longer recognized as North American value. They were treated as foreign liabilities. Even U.S. analysts described it as economic friendly fire, a policy aimed at China that managed to hit Canada first. Once that line was crossed, Ottawa understood that maintaining the old arrangement meant accepting permanent vulnerability. Withdrawal became less a choice and more an act of national self-respect.
This shift is not emotional. It is not reactionary. It is a meticulously planned repositioning of Canada's industrial footing. Carney's government is making it clear that cooperation must now be earned, not assumed. U.S. automakers will no longer receive special exemptions for simply showing up in Canada. Access to the Canadian market and Canadian labor must be matched by genuine investment, long-term commitments, and demonstrated stability. Instead of anchoring its future to an increasingly volatile U.S. policy environment, Canada is widening its field of partners. Carney's Asia-focused diplomacy, reinforced by new economic channels with South Korea, Japan, and even the unexpectedly productive APEC meeting with Xi Jinping, signals a shift toward diversification. Reliable partners are welcome. Unpredictable ones will not shape Canada's economy again. The irony is striking. Trump's tariffs were designed to protect American jobs, yet they are now destabilizing the very companies they were meant to defend. The U.S. auto industry has long depended on seamless access to Canadian parts, engineering, and materials. When those links are disrupted, production delays spread rapidly. A component stuck at the border forces assembly lines to slow. A surge in Canadian prices inflates the cost of an American-built SUV. The slightest uncertainty causes investment plans to freeze. Bloomberg reports that U.S. automakers are already facing higher operating costs and increasingly complex supply chain hurdles. The industry cannot build competitive cars without predictable partners, and right now, the United States is the least predictable actor in the North American market. This is not Canada damaging the U.S. auto sector. It is the United States damaging itself, and Canada simply refusing to take the blow in silence.
Behind closed doors,
Canadian officials now refer to the USMCA as a zombie deal, technically alive but hollowed out by unilateral American decisions. A trade agreement cannot function when one country rewrites rules without consultation, especially in an industry as integrated as autos. By stepping back from auto cooperation arrangements, Canada is not abandoning USMCA. It is responding to the reality that the United States abandoned the spirit of the agreement long ago.
As North America argues, Asia is quietly positioning itself as the world's most reliable manufacturing bloc. South Korea is expanding global defense industrial partnerships. Japan is deepening long-term EV battery alliances. ASEAN economies are emerging as essential mid-stage production hubs. Even China, despite tensions, is ready to court Canadian investment with offers of stability and scale. For Canada, this is less a pivot and more a rebalancing. For the U.S., it is a warning. Global leadership is never guaranteed, and reliability is now a global currency. If America chooses chaos, others will choose opportunity.
For years, Canada tolerated disrespect disguised as negotiation. It endured being labeled a national security threat over steel and aluminum. It watched the U.S. weaponize access to its own market. It absorbed corporate withdrawals justified by American politics, not economic logic. This withdrawal is the clearest declaration yet that Canada is finished playing the junior role. The country is not isolating itself, it is reclaiming its agency. Carney's message is simple. Canada will cooperate when cooperation is mutual, not when it is expected. Canada's decision to withdraw from U.S. auto cooperation is not a rupture, it is a restoration of balance. After a year of tariff pressure, broken commitments, and unpredictable policy swings, Ottawa has acted with a confidence that reflects both its national interest and its global potential. The road ahead will not be simple, but the direction is unmistakable. Canada is done waiting for Washington to treat it like a partner. From now on, Canada chooses its own path, its own terms, and its own future. The real question is whether the United States is prepared to adapt to a North American landscape where Canada is no longer the quiet neighbor, but an independent power that knows its worth.
On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping held back-to-back meetings with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Japan, signaling Beijing's intent to ease recent diplomatic tensions with both nations. At the meeting, Xi extended an invitation to Carney to visit China, describing it as an opportunity to continue dialogue and explore areas of mutual benefit. The Canadian leader welcomed the offer, saying it represented a chance to continue the dialogue in a constructive way.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just achieved a quiet but remarkable diplomatic breakthrough at the 2025 APEC summit in Gyeongju, South Korea. The gathering of world leaders was meant to discuss trade recovery and supply chain resilience, yet the real headline emerged from two back-to-back meetings: Xi Jinping's talks with Carney and Japan's Sanae Takaichi. While Donald Trump left the summit early after declaring his America First agenda fulfilled, Beijing stayed and recalibrated. Xi's calm tone stood in sharp contrast to months of tariff friction and tense diplomacy. For Canada, the moment was both symbolic and strategic, proof that a nation long overshadowed by its U.S. neighbor could carve its own path in Asia's reshaping order. Mark Carney arrived at APEC with one objective: rebuild Canada's economic flexibility. After a year of industrial losses tied to U.S. trade disputes, Ottawa needed new partners and new momentum. The meeting with Xi Jinping, though brief, validated Carney's wider Asia strategy, working with South Korea, ASEAN, and Australia to broaden Canada's network before the 2026 USMCA review. At the Jeonju session, Canada's presence stood out. It was no longer a secondary participant following Washington's lead, but a country pursuing its own balance. Diplomatic officials confirmed that discussions touched on trade coordination, clean energy cooperation, and reopening ministerial channels frozen since 2018.
No headline deal emerged, yet the tone mattered. Measured, respectful, and open to rebuilding trust. For Carney, tone itself was progress, the first sign that dialogue could replace defensive rhetoric. China's outreach was deliberate. After a year of slowing exports and capital outflows, Beijing began stabilizing relations with mid-sized economies. Engaging Canada helps diversify partnerships within the G7 and demonstrates to investors that China can still manage diplomacy with Western nations. It also acknowledges the limits of confrontation. Officials in Beijing framed this shift as pragmatic recovery. Rather than competing for dominance, China is courting predictability. For Canada, that shift opens practical lanes: cooperation in food safety, clean technology, and mineral supply chains that both sides need. For China, it restores a measure of credibility within APEC after years of disputes over detained citizens and export restrictions. The gesture is small, but in Asian diplomacy, small gestures often start bigger realignments. Xi's second meeting, with Japan's Sanae Takaichi, followed the same tone: cordial, brief, but deliberate. It showed Beijing testing a selective détente across the region. Japan, though closely aligned with U.S. security policy, depends heavily on stable trade with China. Both leaders discussed maritime cooperation and managing long-standing disputes in the East China Sea. Together, the two meetings reshaped the narrative of APEC 2025. They marked the first synchronized attempt by China, Canada, and Japan to moderate rivalry instead of escalate it. For Carney, this multipolar atmosphere creates opportunity. As the world splits between tariff walls and security blocks, Canada positions itself as the pragmatic bridge, small enough to talk to everyone, credible enough to be heard. By the summit's end, no joint statement changed the rules of global trade. Yet something more valuable occurred: a reset in tone and trust. The APEC images of Carney and Xi shaking hands captured a turning point for Canada's foreign policy, from a defensive stance to active diplomacy. Carney's approach shows that influence is not measured only by tariffs or GDP, but by composure and persistence. Amid U.S. volatility and Chinese recalibration, Canada found room to maneuver. If this cautious engagement continues, it could lay the groundwork for new trade corridors across Asia, defined not by ideology, but by stability. The Gyeongju summit may fade from headlines, yet its meaning endures. In a world of escalating economic confrontation, Canada quietly proved that dialogue still works, and that sometimes diplomacy's smallest gestures can mark the biggest shift.
You know, President Trump wants to come after the jobs and create uncertainty, not only in Canada, but across the world.
And we're going to begin in Washington, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading for yet another high-stakes meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. A critical moment as Canada is seeking tariff relief.
The days before one of the year's most anticipated meetings, the mood in Washington feels tense. Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing to meet U.S. President Donald Trump on October 7, his second trip to the White House since taking office. Back home, critics demand results. In Ottawa, his team chooses every word carefully. But before Carney even boards his flight, the story shifts. In Quebec City, at the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Conference, several American governors from Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania speak out against the tariffs, straining relations between their country and Canada. They remind everyone that more than 55 million jobs depend on the cross-border economy. These are not foreign observers. They are Trump's own partners, warning that his trade policies are hurting their communities. For years, Trump has described tariffs as proof of strength. Now, those same policies are drawing resistance from inside America. What was meant to pressure Canada is starting to pressure Washington itself. As Carney prepares for the meeting, he carries with him the unexpected support of U.S. governors who have publicly stood with Canada.
You know, we are friends, we're allies.
Canada got some support from a delegation of governors from Great Lakes states, all of which are closely tied to the Canadian economy.
What is not helpful is the way in which the president has demeaned
our neighbors in the north, suggesting that they should be the 51st state. I respect Canadian sovereignty.
The reason is simple economics. The Great Lakes region is one of the most integrated industrial corridors in the world. The auto industry, steel producers, and aluminum smelters on both sides of the border operate as a single system. When tariffs slice through that network, they don't separate rivals from friends. They break the same machine both depend on. In automobiles, for example, a single North American car crosses the border several times before reaching the showroom. Parts made in Windsor often travel to Detroit for assembly and return to Ontario for finishing. Each tariff on metals or components adds cost at every crossing. For factories in Michigan and Ohio, that means higher prices and slower schedules. The metals that feed those plants tell the same story. Canada supplies roughly 90% of the primary aluminum imported by the United States, most used in cars and aircraft. Steel from Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie becomes the raw material for mills in Illinois and Pennsylvania. When Washington taxes those imports at 25 to 50%, U.S. manufacturers pay more for materials they cannot source domestically. Energy links reinforce the dependency. Pipelines and power lines cross the border daily, keeping refineries and auto plants running. Ontario and Quebec rely on U.S. natural gas, while American states rely on Canadian electricity and oil. The supply chain moves in both directions. That is why the governors of Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are alarmed. Every new tariff threatens thousands of local jobs, from assembly lines in Detroit to ports along Lake Superior. Even brief disruptions ripple through transport and retail. By defending Canada, these governors are protecting their own voters. They know that punishing Canada means punishing themselves. Their message is practical. Keep the border open or risk breaking an economy that sustains both nations. For Carney, that shared interest transforms his trip. He represents not only Canada, but an industrial region stretching from Ontario's auto belt to Ohio's steel towns. Out of that conference emerges a quiet but powerful alliance. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford and Quebec's Premier François Legault stand with their U.S. counterparts to stress cooperation over confrontation. For decades, the Great Lakes region has functioned as one economy. Cars assembled in Detroit rely on parts from Windsor. Aluminum from Quebec feeds aerospace plants in New York. This regional unity gives Carney an advantage ahead of his meeting. He can present himself not as a foreign petitioner, but as a partner speaking for a shared industrial base. The governor's support offers political cover and moral leverage in Washington. Across the Midwest, workers and business owners are realizing that their prosperity depends on the same open border that Trump's tariffs are closing. In Washington, Carney's team is finalizing briefing notes for the October 7 meeting. According to CBC News and Radio Canada, the main goal is partial relief on steel tariffs and a framework for future reductions. Officials are careful not to raise expectations. Trump's unpredictability is well known in Ottawa. The White House is also under pressure from a partial government shutdown and business groups warning of higher costs. Within that environment, Carney will argue that Canada is a trusted ally whose industries are vital to U.S. growth and security. His leverage comes from three fronts. First, critical minerals. Canada supplies nickel, cobalt, and lithium, all listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as strategic. Second, defense spending. Carney's plan to expand Canada's military budget by tens of billions could translate into contracts for U.S. suppliers if trade tensions ease. Third, political support from U.S. governors urging tariff relief. Trump still holds the power to adjust or keep duties under Section 232, but rising frustration from border states makes a limited compromise possible. Analysts expect any early progress to center on aluminum, where U.S. factories rely heavily on Canadian imports. Lumber, tied to domestic politics, will likely remain unchanged. As the meeting nears, the real question is not whether Carney secures everything he wants, but whether Trump can afford to keep everything he has. Whatever happens on October 7, the political landscape in North America has already shifted. Trump's tariffs, once seen as a display of power, are now testing his own coalition. The Governors' Conference in Quebec City was a warning that economic pain does not stop at the border. In a region so integrated, punishing a neighbor often means punishing yourself. For Canada, this week is a moment to prove that patience and strategy can outlast bluster. Carney is entering the talks with a clear message that Canada's strength lies not only in its resources but in its relationships with workers, businesses, and now with American leaders who see their futures linked to its success. The tariff war of 2025 has no victors yet, but the debate has changed. When American governors stand beside Canadian premiers to defend a shared economy, it signals a new kind of politics, one that recognizes the real battle is not between nations, but between cooperation and self-inflicted harm. As the White House meeting draws near, both countries wait. For Trump, the choice is whether to double down or step back. For Carney, the test is whether he can turn growing American frustration into meaningful relief. And for millions of workers across the Great Lakes, the stakes could not be clearer. Their jobs and the future of North America's economy now depend on what happens next in Washington.